Thank you very much, Senator Flake. And let me say at the outset that the Republican senator from Arizona and I have worked together on many, many issues. I respect him very much. I count him as a friend, and I look forward to continuing to work with him on a bipartisan basis to deal with a myriad of issues which we share an interest in. But this is one issue where we disagree. The FACT Act would penalize Americans who are sick and dying from asbestos exposure, and many of them are veterans. In fact, 30% of the claimants of asbestos exposure are veterans. And it would be an unwarranted giveaway to the companies that made the products that contained asbestos, made a profit from those products, and did so knowingly, knowing it was a dangerous and deadly fiber. Let's start with some historical perspective. Throughout much of the 20th century, asbestos was used in thousands of industrial, household, and military products. Insulation, piping, roof shingles, brake pads, floor tiles, on and on. The use of asbestos in America actually peaked in 1973. All the time, it was known that asbestos was dangerous. According to the GAO, as early as 1900, asbestos was recognized as a cause of occupational disease, namely asbestosis. 100 years ago, it was a Prudential insurance company which announced it wasn't going to provide life insurance or sell life insurance to people who worked around asbestos because their lives were compromised by their exposure. That was 100 years ago. By 1960, the connection between asbestos and mesothelioma, a cancer of the lining of the lungs, chest, or abdomen that typically causes death within 1 or 2 years, was firmly established. So did the companies that made the asbestos products know about the dangers? Of course. What did they do? Did they warn their customers? Did they warn their employees? In most cases, not at all. And what happened? We're now losing, on average, 10,000 Americans a year to asbestos-related disease. 10,000 who were exposed to asbestos at some point in their lives, exposed to the products that these companies made and turned a profit on, and now are trying to reduce and escape liability. According to the GAO, at least 27 million Americans were exposed to asbestos. They include construction workers, auto mechanics, pipe fitters, shipyard workers, members of the military, as well as family members. One of my closest friends on earth was diagnosed with mesothelioma last year. She's the wife of a man who worked around asbestos. She did the laundry, and she is the victim. Asbestos is still present in the U.S. today. Dozens of companies have banned asbestos, but it is not banned in the United States. Companies continue to import hundreds of tons of asbestos into our country every year. And workers, first responders, and others continue to be exposed, especially when buildings are renovated or dismantled. As I mentioned earlier, 10 to 15,000 Americans die each year from asbestos-related disease. People are still getting sick. The number of asbestos victims and families are represented here today. Sue Vento's here. Sue's husband, Bruce, was a member of the United States House of Representatives representing the 4th District of Minnesota. Bruce was my friend. Bruce's locker was next to mine in the House gym. He was a man who was very concerned about health and fitness. Unknowingly, he had been exposed, as Sue will explain, to asbestos at an earlier part of his life, and it took his life. Linda Reinstein of Los Angeles, whose husband Alan died of mesothelioma. Linda founded the nonprofit Asbestos Disease Awareness Organization to stand up for asbestos victims. Senior Airman retired, she's here, Shandy Speedy of San Antonio, Texas. Airman Speedy, who served honorably in the U.S. Air Force, has mesothelioma. She's 26 years old. Would all those in the audience who suffer from asbestos-related disease or have lost a loved one, please raise your hand. Thank you. Thank you for putting a face on this issue. Unfortunately, it's victims like these who are the targets of this legislation that is before us. Under this legislation, if an asbestos victim, like Airman Sheedy, wants to seek compensation from one of the 60 bankruptcy trusts that were set up by asbestos companies to compensate victims, she would be forced to compromise her own privacy. Her name, her identifying information, the last 4 digits of her Social Security, her asbestos exposure history, her claim information, and any compensation she received would be part of a public database. This registry of sick Americans would be ripe for abuse by cyber criminals and phishers. And the information in the registry could be used to discriminate against the victims when it comes to employment loans. There is no need to violate victims' privacy this way. If asbestos defendants, that is, asbestos companies, want information from the trusts about claimants, they can get it today through court-ordered subpoenas and through discovery. But the FACT Act, which is before us now, doesn't just invade victims' privacy. It also allows asbestos companies to demand any information they want from an asbestos trust at any time about any trust claimant. This would allow these defendant asbestos companies to drag out litigation through endless information requests. Sadly, we know what happens when these cases are dragged out. The victims don't live to see the result. And it would also slow down the ability of trusts to process claims, because the trusts would have to spend thousands of hours complying with information requests. Victims would die while waiting for relief. Last month, the FACT Act was considered in the House. The only thing bipartisan about the bill was the opposition. Every Democrat and 16 Republicans voted against it. There are a broad range of groups opposed to this bill, and many are represented today. I want to especially thank the veterans organizations that are here, representing 30% of the claimants who are veterans and who would be adversely affected by this bill. They include the AMVETS, Military Officers Association of America, Military Order of the Purple Heart, the Vietnam Veterans Association, the Association of the United States Navy, the U.S. Army Warrant Officers Association, and other groups such as the International Association of Firefighters, the AFL-CIO, the National Education Association, the Asbestos Disease Awareness Organization, and a myriad of other veterans, consumer, labor, environmental, and privacy groups. I ask consent to place in the record letters from these groups, as well as letters from 44 individual asbestos victims and family members.
Without objection.
Let me make two more brief points. First, the FACT Act would amend the federal bankruptcy code, but only to help asbestos companies. Why does the other party oppose reforming the bankruptcy code when we want to bring up issues such as student college debt, which is also one aspect of bankruptcy code? We've had no luck moving that. Underwater homeowners who were abused and ended up being fleeced by many of the lenders. People with crushing medical debt. And, of course, Puerto Rico, which is in partial default. We can't touch the bankruptcy code for any of these groups. It's a sad reflection of our priorities that we're going after asbestos victims to change the bankruptcy code. Also, this bill puts an onerous burden on victims and trust in the name of transparency. Where is the transparency when it comes to the companies that manufactured the products with asbestos that ended up in our homes, schools, and workplaces? This bill lets those companies keep their settlements secret. Many people who were asbestos victims were exposed decades ago, racking their brains to figure out when was this exposure. Now, these trusts know where the exposures took place and, in fact, are paying some victims, but they're keeping that information confidential, information which would help a victim establish whether or not the trust or the defendant company is responsible. So it's secrecy on the side of the criminal defendant, or the civil defendants in these cases, and it's transparency when it comes to the victims. I want to close by quoting a powerful letter the committee received this week from 17 veterans organizations, including those I mentioned earlier, and here's what it says. Our veterans are disproportionately impacted by asbestos disease, including the painful and almost always fatal mesothelioma. In fact, while veterans make up about 8% of the U.S. population, they account for 30% of those who are diagnosed with and die from this disease. Forcing our veterans to publicize their work history, medical conditions, part of their Social Security numbers, and information about their children and families is an offensive invasion of privacy to the men and women who have honorably served, and it does nothing to assure their adequate compensation or to prevent further exposure and death. All of this to give big asbestos corporations an advantage in litigation and shift the cost of discovery to the Asbestos Compensation Trust. S-357 is a bill that its supporters claim will help asbestos victims, but the reality is that this bill only helps companies and manufacturers who knowingly expose this deadly fiber to our honorable men and women who've made sacrifices for our country. The veterans do not forget. I want to thank all the victims and family members and members of the veteran organizations who've come here today. I look forward to the witness testimony.